Hello everyone, I'm Gui Valente and this is the Valente Brothers podcast. Once again, I'm joined by Pedro Valente.
Thank you very much for joining us one more time. Let's talk about the history of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil.
Joaquim Valente.
Hello everyone.
As Professor Pedro said, today we're going to talk about the history of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, and we're going to start addressing a very controversial topic, the history of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. And recently, actually a few years already back, but recently through books and documentaries and a lot of material online, this gained some momentum, and I think it's time for us to tackle this. The myths of...
So-called myths.
The so-called myths of Jiu-Jitsu involving the Gracie family. And I think that Pedro is a great source of information. We have, all of us, studied a lot the history, researched a lot, not only here in the United States, but going back to Brazil, going back to all of the material that's available now that has been digitalized over the years, newspaper articles, everything that Hélio Gracie also left for us. Grandmaster Helio left the good and the bad newspaper articles. But we also went ahead and we went to the sources, right? We went to the is it the Brazilian National Library?
National Archives and National Library, yes.
And we were able to find a lot of information to really, it's a puzzle. Feels like we're trying to put a puzzle together, and it's in many ways fascinating, and in many ways it really helps us understand Jiu-Jitsu better. So, should we start with some of the myths, or so-called myths?
And yes, we should. And I believe that it is important for us to look at all this objectively. Unfortunately, there is a lot of hate out there, haters, trying to create conspiracy theories.
Why is that?
I guess it's human nature. Some people are just jealous of the success of others. And it's unfortunate because people who love Jiu-Jitsu, whose lives have been changed by Jiu-Jitsu, criticizing those who in many ways brought it for them, without whom they would not be practicing and enjoying the art that they love.
And the criticism many times is in regards to possibly a very famous Jiu-Jitsu teacher or someone who was a very famous Jiu-Jitsu fighter, not giving credit to those that came before them. And I understand, I believe personally, we believe that's why we have a museum just outside our library to recognize the history, and as we research and as we discover the people and the facts that really made Jiu-Jitsu what it is today, we try to pay tribute to that in our museum. But I think that if someone is not a historian, if they are not a researcher, they don't have the obligation to cite and to talk about everyone that came before them. Imagine a basketball player today having to talk. I think it's very nice, and I appreciate when they do that, right? I really enjoy, I love professional sports. I really like basketball, and it's nice to see a professional basketball player talking about Wilt Chamberlain, talking about all the great Bill Russell and all the great players that came before them. But it's not their obligation.
And it's not their obligation to be 100% accurate about everything. Now we have access to these national archives, but before, many times they are talking about things that they didn't witness. Yeah. They weren't even born when these events actually took place. And it's a lot of hearsay. They hear stories from the older generation, and the older generation many times are discussing things that happened 30, 40, 50 years before. And it's natural that this information many times is not accurate. It's up to the researchers, it's up to the historians to be able to tell the story accurately. This hate that we see online creates conspiracy theories. right? I found this article with these so-called myths, and they actually say that the Gracie family conspired to suppress the facts of the family history. Like, the family conspired to suppress the facts, as if there was like a meeting, and they were discussing, look, we're not going to say this, and we are part of the Jiu-Jitsu family. We've been around this for a long time, for 3 generations, and we know that this is absolutely not true. We know that sometimes claims are made that are not accurate, but there's no bad will, there's no bad intention. It's just that many times people don't know.
Let's go to the myths, or the so-called myths, because I think some of these are completely unfounded.
Correct.
So, according to this, there's a myth that Elio invented modern BJJ. I agree with that. I think it's true. It's not a myth. But go ahead, and I'll explain why I believe that's true and not a myth.
We've talked about this several times, so I know why you think it's true, and I think that from that perspective, it is true. But let's start by saying that Hélio Gracie himself, in several interviews, said that he didn't invent anything.
Yeah, but let's also define, so I think this is also one of the difficulties in all of this. And so Elio invented modern BJJ. So what is the author talking about? Because modern BJJ could have different definitions. So what is he saying here? He's talking about Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, the Brazilian lineage of Jiu-Jitsu?
Yeah, he talks about everything and mixes everything up. So I think when you say modern BJJ, so modern BJJ, so BJJ of the modern times, right? Because if you talk about the 1930s, there's nothing modern about BJJ in the 1930s. It's modern Jiu-Jitsu, but not modern BJJ. Modern BJJ, this article I think was written in 2016. So if he's talking about modern BJJ, he needs to be talking about something that happened not more than 20, 30 years before. So modern BJJ to me is what we see in the IBJJF tournaments. And those rules were created or invented by a federation that was presided by Grandmaster Hélio Gracie. So if you're going to, obviously it's a collective effort.
Correct.
Like everything else in life.
Grandmaster Carlos Gracie was, I don't know if officially, but he was like a chairman.
Chairman of the board.
Chairman of the board.
And there were other directors under Grandmaster Helio who obviously played a very important role. But the president of the federation
and the chairman of the federation were Carlos and
Hélio Gracie. So those two invented modern BJJ as a sport. If you go to Wikipedia and you look at when the sport of football or soccer was created, they don't talk about the ancient Chinese game where they were kicking the ball and it was very similar. They talk about the rules, the modern rules of the sport. And they go back to the 19th century in England. So the sport that is practiced today, called BJJ, was invented by Hélio Gracie. Obviously, Grandmaster Carlos Gracie should be given credit for that as well, as the brothers were very united and worked together.
As some other grandmasters like Francisco Mansur, João Alberto Barreto,
Elcio Leal
Binda, who was the executive
yes.
of the federation, and others who contributed as well. So, how should we then say this? It's then false to say that this is a myth?
Correct.
Now, like you said before, Hélio Gracie talked about mais jiu-jitsu. In Portuguese, when you say mais jiu-jitsu, o meu jiu-jitsu, o meu futebol, we talk about, every Brazilian knows that our style of soccer, the Brazilian style of soccer, was developed in Brazil, and it means what? In general, even though there are different styles of soccer in Brazil, depending on the region, but what became world famous? The ginga, that very relaxed, creative style of soccer.
Jogo bonito, as they call it.
Jogo bonito, correct. So, when Grandmaster Helio referred to his jiu-jitsu, he's talking about what he practiced for almost 80 years and the style that he developed. On top of that, the teaching method that he developed, that he was part of the process early on, and that he used again for probably 60 years as the head of the academy and the head of the school working on. Now, Hélio Gracie invented the arm lock. Hélio Gracie invented the triangle. He never said that.
Correct. And let me say something. Because they say myth, Hélio Gracie invented modern BJJ. Fact, they call it a fact. Every aspect of early modern BJJ was already being trained and taught as early as 1905 in the USA and England.
False.
And then it says, obviously BJJ has evolved independently of judo since the late 1990s. He calls this a fact. So the evolution, the independent evolution of jiu-jitsu in Brazil from judo only started in the late 90s, and he calls this a fact. You trained judo in the 80s, didn't you?
A lot.
Was it the same as what you learned in jiu-jitsu?
Completely different.
Completely different.
So it's sad that they call this a fact. They call myth Hélio Gracie invented modern BJJ. And if we're talking about the sport, he did. Fact, the evolution, the independent evolution of jiu-jitsu with respect to judo in Brazil only started in the late 90s. That's called a fact by this article.
Yeah, sometimes when we talk about history, of course, we have students from all over the world traveling to Miami to visit our school and to train in our school and to participate in courses. We have even courses on the history of jiu-jitsu, of the martial arts. But sometimes I see some comments on our YouTube videos. Some individuals claim that we're very biased because we were students of Hélio Gracie. And what would you respond to that?
I would respond that we, even though there is a bias, no question, Hélio Gracie was like a grandfather to us, so we're not going to deny that. But we are always open to discussing with anyone about these subjects based on the facts. So we would not allow our bias to interfere with our objectivity. And if anyone wants to have a debate with us on these issues, presenting facts without emotional reactions, without hate, but just discussing the facts, we are totally open to being convinced otherwise.
As was Grandmaster Helio.
100%.
And I think this is something that, he always spoke about, that he was always open to change. If he believed that change was done with rectitude, if he believed that change was for justice. And I think that's why we continue and we follow that same belief. Now, one thing that Grandmaster Pedro always talks about, Professor Pedro always talks about is soon is the idea that today the access to information is so much easier, right? From our phones, we have access to all the national archives. We have access to YouTube videos from footage from the 50s, from the 60s, sometimes even from early on. And we can really see, oh yeah, this was done before, this was not. But as a jiu-jitsu practitioner, many times we find techniques that we believe that we were the ones who created, that we were having that conversation recently, correct?
Correct. That's very, very common. In the book Game of Jiu-Jitsu, written by Taro Miyake and Yuki Utani in 1905, some of the pioneers of jiu-jitsu in the Western world, talks about that every advanced practitioner actually develops a personal style of jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu lends itself for great creativity by the practitioner who develops a personal style. And so that is very natural, especially for those who don't study the history and don't look at the repertoire of techniques of fighters who came before. They might have that impression, that illusion, that they created something when something was actually done before.
But that illusion today is much easier for you to not have that illusion when you're constantly seeing footage and you're seeing techniques on the internet that are very similar to what you're doing.
Correct.
But back then, when to send a letter from one place to the other would take a long time, for you to be able to have that same notion would be much harder.
Absolutely. And let me go back to the article here, because it says the following. The Gracies did not use any techniques that were not used by every Jiu-Jitsu man and Luta Livre fighters. The Gracies did not use any techniques that were not used by every Jiu-Jitsu man. So the person who wrote this article, the question that I would have for this person is this. How many lessons did he take with Hélio Gracie to know exactly every technique that Hélio Gracie knew and was using back in the 30s? How many videos of Hélio Gracie's fights has this person seen to be able to make this assertion? I think this assertion becomes impossible for someone who does not know Hélio Gracie deeply and the techniques that he was using. To say that no techniques, that every technique that Hélio Gracie was using was also used by every Jiu-Jitsu fighter. Every. Right? So you can see that this is not, and this is treated as a fact.
Yes, and we would like to invite the author of this document and of these books. We don't know the author's name.
Correct.
He uses a pseudonym, but we would be very interested to have him come even here.
Yes.
To our school, or if that's not possible, to have a conference online so that we can
debate.
And we would like to
and possibly be
invite
convinced by him.
And possibly be convinced by him, of course, because that's really our objective as we study history and as we research. We feel that unlike a fighter, we are teachers. And as Jiu-Jitsu teachers, and we believe in teaching Jiu-Jitsu in a very holistic way, it is our responsibility to teach history. It is our responsibility to teach the philosophy. And to do that, we have to prepare ourselves and we have to study. And if there's something that we're saying, that we're writing, that is incorrect, and it has happened already, we are always willing to make those changes, 100%. So whoever wrote this, the author of a few books, again, he uses a pseudonym. So please, if anyone knows him, please let him know that he is invited to have a discussion with us, if he wants to meet us in person, or if he wants to have a debate, private or in public. We're open to that. Another claim that he makes is that Elio, or a myth that was said that Elio invented leverage. What do you say to that?
Hélio Gracie never said that. He invented leverage?
Yeah, the author says that Elio didn't say he invented leverage. He said in 2001 that he added leverage to the techniques that he assimilated by watching his brother.
He used to use the example of the jack. He said, can you lift a car with your hands? And the person would say, no. He said, I can, I use a jack. So what I did is when I had difficulty using a technique, I would add a jack, I would add leverage, I would try to do it in an easier way. And let me ask you, who doesn't do that? Who doesn't always try? And that's what the game of Jiu-Jitsu says. It allows for the practitioner to always try to adapt. And especially someone who had little access to Jiu-Jitsu, right? Grandmaster Carlos Gracie was training under Mitsuyo Maeda, and that's another one that they call a myth, and we can discuss this one as well, for a few years. And so they were all very eager to learn and trying to improvise and develop their own style and training a lot. So it's only natural that these things happen. But to say that he invented leverage, he would always use actually a quote by Archimedes, where if give me a lever and I can lift the earth, the world. So give me a point of support, give me a fulcrum, and I can lift the world. I don't remember exactly the quote, but obviously leverage was not invented by Hélio Gracie, and he never claimed that.
So I'm going to keep reading through them. If you have any others that you think are
I think one that we can discuss, and it's repeated here over and over, is this. I'll use this 12th one here. It says, myth, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not Kodokan Judo. So it's a myth that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not Kodokan Judo. So what he's trying to say is that the fact is that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is Kodokan Judo.
And Pedro, I think it's worth saying that this is a pretty common point, that not just this gentleman, maybe he influenced others, but a few researchers, a few historians make this claim. And unfortunately, I believe that most of these historians, like you asked earlier, our experience training judo as children, even as young adults, in different judo schools and very respected and top-level judo schools in Brazil. I also had the opportunity to visit the Kodokan in Japan. I know that both of you had that as well. And we also, of course, we practice jiu-jitsu not only with Hélio Gracie himself, but with many jiu-jitsu teachers under Grandmaster Helio. And this makes absolutely no sense.
No sense. It's just false. And I think first we need to define Kodokan Judo. And that's something that we've been studying a lot lately. And by the way, we have great respect for Kodokan Judo. We have great respect for Jigoro Kano, Grandmaster Jigoro Kano.
One of our students moved to Japan for a short period, and he was going back and forth due to work. And he asked me at the time, what should I do? Should I find a school in Japan? This is years ago, probably 12 years ago. And I said, you know what? Why don't you go to the Kodokan? He lived very close to the Kodokan. And I know that now there are several jiu-jitsu schools in Japan too. But at the time, I thought for his development, it would be best for him to go to Kodokan. And he joined the Kodokan and he became a black belt in judo.
And we trained judo from when we were little kids, and the judo training really helped us.
Hélio Gracie trained judo.
Correct. With Tada, his Japanese judo teacher. But to say that judo and jiu-jitsu are the same and that jiu-jitsu in Brazil is nothing but Kodokan Judo is just false. And as I said, first we have to define what Kodokan Judo is. Kodokan Judo is a style of jiu-jitsu. Kodokan Judo is a teaching according to Jigoro Kano himself. Because the words are not so different, right? For us, when we hear these words, they sound very different. Judo, jiu-jitsu. But for a Japanese person, it's the art of flexibility, gentle art. You can call it different names, but it's the gentle art or the gentle way. The most important word is jiu-jitsu, judo. So they asked Jigoro Kano, why not come up with a completely new word? They're too similar. He said, because I wouldn't feel comfortable because what I'm doing is the same. But I introduced a new teaching methodology based on scientific methods, grouping the techniques differently. He lived 1 year in Germany, for example, 1 year of his life in Germany. He studied Western teaching methodologies, scientific ways, and he introduced all of that and created his own style of teaching jiu-jitsu, but it was still jiu-jitsu. It was still jiu-jitsu. So when they say that jiu-jitsu is judo, I would say that judo is jiu-jitsu. Now, Jigoro Kano's method was very particular. He had the Gokyo, the set of the 5 groups of techniques. So in order for to be true to Jigoro Kano, in order for a style of jiu-jitsu to be called Kodokan Judo, they have to follow the Kodokan method. And it is a fact that the Gracies never followed the Kodokan method.
And just a quick recap for those of you that don't know the story. Jigoro Kano, as Pedro said, was a student of jiu-jitsu. A couple different jiu-jitsu schools, possibly 3 he had access to. And after opening his own school, he wanted to introduce jiu-jitsu in the education system of Japan. A very brief version of the story. He was not able to do that. And in part, the reason was that jiu-jitsu had developed a bad reputation in Japan for various reasons. So he decided to, and this is my own opinion now, he decided to rebrand jiu-jitsu. And in doing that, he had to change the name. And it was just a very simple change, as Pedro just pointed out. Instead of jiu-jitsu, Judo. That's what happened. And he did an amazing job.
And what
in
does
organization, his methodology. Jigoro Kano was a brilliant educator.
and why do? Because he wanted to say, look, this is not just fighting. It's not jitsu. It's not our old ways. It's do, which means an enlightened path, a way of life, a philosophy.
Connected with the Meiji Restoration, the period that Japan was at the moment in. And Meiji is exactly that, enlightenment, the light.
And it was still a style of jiu-jitsu. And many of the Japanese who were teaching in Brazil, I can mention the Ono brothers, who were very, very high-level practitioners, black belts from Japan who moved to Brazil. They would actually refer to judo as the more sportive and grappling aspect, and to jiu-jitsu as the self-defense.
And when you mention Ono, it reminds me of Grandmaster Helio. Whenever he told us about his fight with one of the Ono brothers, Grandmaster Helio was very humble. And Grandmaster Helio always respected those that could actually teach him something. And talking about jiu-jitsu, of course. And he always said, you know, the first round or the first 2 rounds that when I fought Ono, I felt like I was inside a blender. That's how he referred to his experience fighting Ono. It felt like he dominated me in such a way that it felt like I was inside a blender. And he would tell this to his students. He was not afraid to show any type of weakness. And he was very proud that he was able to resist Ono's attacks and not be tapped out, not lose that grappling challenge.
Correct.
So,
another myth that I think we can discuss
yes,
is when they say...
I looked up the quote, just sorry, very quickly, that Gui asked. It says, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world."
Yes.
and that's really what jiu-jitsu is. A big part of jiu-jitsu is the lever and the fulcrum. Every technique, you have to understand where's the lever and where's the fulcrum.
Correct.
Grandmaster João Alberto Barreto really likes to use the lever and the fulcrum when he's explaining techniques.
Correct. So another myth here, and let's focus on Helio Gracie as a fighter. I think the first thing that we should mention is that Helio Gracie never claimed that he was a great fighter. He always gave credit to jiu-jitsu.
He always said, I'm a weak guy, skinny.
Exactly.
And many people then, we can talk about that, misinterpret that.
Yes.
And he was trying, Grandmaster Helio, now there's this whole, I might be jumping ahead, Pedro, but, Grandmaster Helio was not weak.
And
he was an athlete.
They also
already.
treat that as a myth here. Myth 21. Helio was small, sickly, and weak. Myth.
Grandmaster Helio was very skinny. He was very light. He fought fighters that were often much heavier than he was. But the reason why he was always saying that, not only because it was true, but it was because he wanted to keep the spotlight on jiu-jitsu, not on himself. It's a great thing. He did not even like to take pictures showing any of his, like his physique or his muscles. He was against that. He wanted really to give confidence to students that it's not my strength, it's not Hélio Gracie, it's jiu-jitsu. And if I can do it, you can do it as well. That was his mission, lifelong mission.
Correct. Correct. So, Hélio Gracie defeated a boxing champion.
Is that a myth according to the author?
They call it a myth. And then they say, Antonio Portugal was no champion. It's interesting that later they say Hélio Gracie it's a myth that Hélio Gracie was small, sickly, and weak because he was a champion swimmer. So Antonio Portugal, who was a professional boxer, cannot be called a champion. But Hélio Gracie, who was an amateur teenage swimmer, can be called a champion by him. So he calls Hélio Gracie a champion when it's convenient for him to use the word champion.
But hold on. Was Antonio Portugal in any way...
He was a professional fighter. Was he the national champion? No. there's no record of him ever being a national champion.
But
Helio Gracie was not a champion swimmer either. So that's what I'm saying, that they use the facts conveniently to support their narrative, which is a narrative, let me say, because you would say, why does this gentleman hate Helio Gracie so much? It's not his beef. Apparently, he was very close to someone in Brazil who had a serious problem, a judo teacher in Brazil, who had a serious problem with the Gracies, a personal problem with the Gracies, who used to work for the Gracie and left on very bad terms. And I think because he probably had a very strong connection with this judo teacher, he is perpetuating the feelings of that particular person. And I think that's where this comes from, because we can clearly identify the bias and the hate coming from this person.
But hold on, if somebody is not a champion, should we say they're a champion?
You know what? That's a very interesting question. At that time, and I think that Helio Gracie should definitely not be called a champion.
Well, did he
Swimmer.
win a race? Because that happens even today in jiu-jitsu, in sport jiu-jitsu.
Why the double standard? Did,
Why- a
did
white
Antonio
champion?
Portugal win a fight?
Well, a white belt today in Brazilian jiu-jitsu can call himself
A champion.
a national champion. I don't know, even maybe, sorry, I don't follow sport jiu-jitsu too much, but I think even a world champion, a blue belt can be a world champion. So,
But at that time, you know this better than I do, because you have a master's degree in sports management and sports sciences. But at that time, they didn't have so many organized championships, a national champion. It was difficult to travel. So they used the word Brazilian champion in a different way. Even Helio Gracie himself, he referred to himself as and that's treated as a myth here as well. But at that time, when you were very proficient at something, it was very common for the press to treat you as a Brazilian champion. Brazilian champion. Because
I understand, yes.
there was no Brazilian, official
And
Brazilian
the comparison
championship.
you made was perfect, because Helio Gracie was a champion swimmer, but the boxer was not a champion.
Correct.
And Helio Gracie was a 15-year-old swimmer who
And if Antonio Portugal won a fight, and which was not part of a championship, he's a champion of that event.
Correct. So so that's the point. They're using everything in a way just to try to advance a narrative that in the beginning of the article it's already explained, that there is this conspiracy to change the story.
Yeah, and it's
the same. So go ahead.
It's also because I think that precision is very important. And I think that we should learn always from situations, and we should try to get better, as we said many times. So if it's false that someone is a champion, if it's false that Helio Gracie was a swimming champion, we should understand that. If it's false that Antonio Portugal, he never won any type of championship, we should understand that as well. We should note that historically. However, when we talk about history, as Pedro just said, what's the term? Time relativity? Can we say that?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I don't know the exact term, but you have to look at it from the lens of the time.
The time. And sometimes I think today, even in society, that's very hard when we talk about history in general. It's difficult. Sometimes it's very difficult because we tend to look at situations through our own lens.
Yeah, with the lens from the perspective of the time, with the lens, with the view of that
But
time.
we should do that. So
There's one that I wanted to talk about,
go ahead.
which is myth number 9. Helio Gracie was Brazil's first sports hero, and then period, different sentence. Helio Gracie was a living legend in Brazil. So he's also saying that Helio Gracie was not a living legend in Brazil. And he claims that the only reason that Helio is remembered today is because Helio made Jiu-Jitsu successful in North America. And this one is one that I remember walking with Grandmaster Helio in Brazil, supermarkets and everywhere. And Grandmaster Helio was a very famous person in Brazil. He was recognized by, people from all ages, and especially older people.
Of course.
I remember all the parents of my friends knowing who Grandmaster Helio was, not for any work that was done in the United States by Helio, which was an amazing work, but by the fights that Grandmaster Helio had in Brazil, for the work he did in Brazil.
some people might come to that conclusion because they are from other states in Brazil. And it's true that in the 1980s, if you were in São Paulo or in the Northeast, young people might not know who Hélio Gracie was. But in Rio, he was very famous even in the 90s. I remember in 1988, when there was an altercation in the airport, and my father was a part of it. You can find that story in our previous podcasts. But I remember a lot of people at the airport saying, wow, Hélio Gracie knocked out this guy, Hélio Gracie, Hélio Gracie. So, and this was before the UFC. So once again, they are trying to debunk certain things with no actual
And like you said,
grounding.
you know, the author here in this text doesn't talk about this directly. He talks about different sports, but I've heard from different historians too who say that no, before Hélio Gracie there was a great athlete in Brazil who was forgotten. Well, most people, unfortunately, are forgotten. One of the amazing things about Grandmaster Helio and Grandmaster Carlos is that they were able to almost, perpetuate is a very powerful word, but they were able to maintain their names and their accomplishment through so many generations, very relevant, and actually make it even larger because through their children and through their students, they were able to continue not only having success in fights, but opening schools all over the world. So is that something negative? Should we think, they're only famous because of this or that?
Or in that location, Rio de Janeiro was the capital of Brazil until 1960. So he was very famous in the capital of Brazil.
But what kind of talk is that?
Exactly.
Right? What kind of talk? Oh, he's only famous because his son. Wow, that's great.
Yeah. And it gets worse. Look at this one. Hélio Gracie, myth, 22. Hélio Gracie was a great fighter. Myth. And then it says, Hélio Gracie had 10 public professional fights between 1932 and 1936. 8 of the 10 were grappling only matches. Grappling only matches. So he's saying that the match with Fred Ebert was grappling only, with elbow strikes and knee strikes and headbutts. And the fact that he was able to go against Japanese black belts like Yasuichi Ono, 2 matches, 100 minutes each, 1 hour and 40 minutes each, and not to get submitted. Is that not impressive for a Brazilian person in a Japanese sport at a time that only the Japanese knew this sport? And Hélio Gracie was able to resist, because then he goes on to say that it's a myth that the Gracies were ground fighting experts. It's a myth. Let me tell you something. Takeo Yano was a very respected black belt from Japan. In fact, when he came to Brazil in the 30s, he was the head instructor at Mitsuyo Maeda's school in Belém do Pará. And then he moved to Rio. And he had a match with Hélio Gracie. And he did throw Hélio Gracie many times, but he wanted nothing to do with the ground, because he respected Hélio Gracie's ground grappling skills. And what they say here when they say that the Gracies are not experts, they say all grapplers fought on the ground. All Jiu-Jitsu fighters, Judokas, and Luta Livre fighters fought on the ground. Even pro catch wrestlers. There was nothing unusual about the Gracie's philosophy, strategy, or methodology. That's inaccurate. That's not a fact, because we know that Judo, Kodokan Judo, and even Jigoro Kano favored throwing techniques. And I'm not even discussing if they're right or wrong. But the truth is that Jigoro Kano and Kodokan Judo from the beginning saw the ground as a complement to the throws. And the Gracies saw the throws as a complement to the ground. That inversion is critical. Oh, but there were others doing that before, maybe. But that was not Kodokan Judo. And we have to look at what happened with Mataemon Tanabe. We have to look at the style of Taro Miyake. We have to look at the style of Uenishi, who were not Kodokan representatives. And they say, well, but Hélio Gracie didn't learn from him. Well, but Carlos Gracie learned from Maeda and Jacinto Ferro, who was Maeda's student, in the north of Brazil. And Maeda spent a lot of time with Uenishi, with Yuki Otani, with Taro Miyake in London. And how can you be sure that he was not influenced by them and by their style, especially in having to fight against wrestlers and boxers? So,
and we can get into detail,
sure,
right? But I think that the idea, really, and I'm sure there are many viewers that really like the details and they really like to learn all the small events that took place that led to all of this and to these claims also that justify some of the claims, that make some of the claims completely false. However, I think the message of this video, and we're not going to cover all of it today, is really one of trying to always, and we can go back to Larson, Christian Larson, right? And I'm sure you'll find one of the commandments.
Optimist creed.
Creed, yes. That really touches on the outlook that we should have towards life so that we don't fall in this negativity
Trap.
This trap of trying to disconstruct, if that's the word in English, if that exists, right? Destroy someone's... Deconstruct, I don't know if it exists, but pretty much destroy, we can say destroy. An attempt to rewrite history, which I think sometimes is important, but in this case, it's a clear attempt to just try to attack a beautiful story, a beautiful history.
That helped so many people.
That has helped so many people, that has really put Jiu-Jitsu, the way we practice, all over the world, right? And the people that like sport Jiu-Jitsu, they can do that as well, all over the world. That gives profession to so many people, not just to teachers, but to journalists, to, in business. So many individuals benefit today from the work of Carlos and Hélio Gracie.
And before we go, I want to talk about the first one and the last one.
I actually wanted to talk about another one too, so...
Yes, and we have some time.
Yes.
But the first one, myth number one, anyone who doubts Gracie in action, the history told in the Gracie in action video, is a Gracie hater. I agree, that's a myth. That's a myth. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to question. We do that all the time. And even those who told that story, even Grandmaster Helio Gracie himself wouldn't doubt that, because I have these conversations with him as well.
Oh yeah, those that are offended by the people who are trying to investigate, to research, they think that, don't talk about, the history of Jiu-Jitsu. You don't know, it's what it is, and no, there's no room for any type of discussion. We're completely against that.
Correct. So it is a myth that questioning the history and trying to learn new things.
It's just a tone. What I refer to is the tone of blatantly trying to destroy. Just for the sake of, I'm not going to give you credit. You don't deserve credit. Without even having met these individuals. And from those who are benefiting today from their work. Because when you talk about those that, according to you, have been forgotten, unfortunately, they were forgotten. But the reason why Grandmasters Carlos and Hélio Gracie were not forgotten is the reason why today you have a job.
Correct.
So be grateful.
And maybe why your books are being sold.
Or your videos, or... So, again, and we don't say this in a negative way as well. And we don't say this in a confrontational way. We're always open to a good and healthy debate.
Correct.
We love to debate. That's the one thing that the Valente brothers like to do, is debate.
And we can disagree without becoming disagreeable.
Of course.
We can always be friends in the end.
Yes.
Even if we disagree.
And if you don't want to have Grandmaster Hélio Gracie's or Grandmaster Carlos Gracie's pictures on your school, that's okay too.
Sure.
It's a free country. That's a great thing about the United States of America. But our advice is that it looks bad. That's just an advice. It looks bad for a jiu-jitsu teacher, someone that works in the jiu-jitsu community, to try to take away Grandmaster Hélio's credit or Grandmaster Carlos' credit. I think it's great to talk about Donato Pires dos Reis. Very important. Those of you that don't know Donato, research. It's important to talk about Jacinto Ferro. Just like it's important to talk, without comparing the importance in history, all the great teachers here at Valente Brothers. Valente Brothers is not just about Pedro, Gui, and Joaquim.
Correct.
We have great instructors here.
And some people, one of the myths here is that, Carlos Gracie didn't learn from, or myth, Carlos learned from Mitsui Maeda. First of all, if you weren't there, you don't know.
Correct.
Carlos said he did. So unless you can prove otherwise, you have to go with his word. Because people, they believe, many of these people,
Yes.
they believe everyone else.
Yes.
Everyone else. For example,
I was gonna say
Kimura broke Elio Gracie's arm. Why do you say that? Because Kimura said that in his book. Well, we have pictures of Hélio Gracie in the shower after the fight, washing his head. No, but Kimura said, so it must be true. But Carlos Gracie said he trained with Maeda. And not just Carlos Gracie. Samuel Pinto, that's a primary source. Samuel Pinto, who is the father-in-law of Grandmaster João Alberto Barreto. He was Carlos Gracie's friend in Belém do Pará, and they trained together under Jacinto Ferro and under Mitsui Maeda.
Both natives of Belém do Pará.
Correct.
Now, you mentioned that myth, and you talked about exactly what I was going to mention as well, as far as how some of these historians, they choose. It's a selective process. And it's not even professional, in my opinion.
No.
It's not done professionally. And again, this is not an attack on anyone. It's just my observation. Because when you select sources according to what you're trying, my opinion is this. This is what we've done. We've dived into this history trying to be as unbiased as humanly possible based on our connection with Grandmaster Helio. Again, because we feel that our responsibility as teachers, our word, our honor is right there. We're not going to perpetuate something that we know is false based on our responsibility with our students daily, telling them stories, telling them what happened, talking about history. We can't do that as teachers. So I don't know exactly what number it is.
Mm-hmm. No, so prove to us that something we're saying is not true and we'll change right away. But you have to prove, not with this type of fact, quote-unquote fact that I see here.
Maeda, let me just mention this. Actually, Kimura, they say it's a myth that Kimura invited Grandmaster Helio to go to Japan and to teach in Japan. Why do they say it's a myth? Because it's not published in a newspaper?
Yeah.
What about Grandmaster Helio having a discussion, having a nice chat with his opponent after the fight? Actually, Kimura was in Brazil not just one time, several times, and had other fights in Brazil. Grandmaster Helio was present in these fights, in some of these fights. Isn't it possible that Kimura said, hey, Grandmaster Helio, next time, through a translator, next time you have a chance, it would be great for you to come to Japan so we can meet and you can teach us. I think that's something so natural between two opponents. And no, it's false because it's not in a newspaper. Again, it's a selective process of just choosing sources and choosing what to believe. And that is not enough to convince us.
Correct.
It's not enough to convince us.
You start to see some kind of bad intention.
Correct.
And that's what's problematic.
To deconstruct, like,
Correct.
Professor Gui said, which is correct.
Yes.
Deconstruct.
Deconstruct. Very good.
Good. Anything else?
And then the last one, which is, I think, it can also lead to a bigger conversation, but it says, Helio Gracie, it's a myth that Helio Gracie introduced Jiu-Jitsu to America. That's so unfair. Because, yes, we know that Grandmaster João Alberto Barreto, Grandmaster Flávio Bering were in America before Helio, doing demonstrations for the FBI. Carley Gracie came before Helio. Reilson Gracie also apparently was here in America before Helio. The same way that some Jiu-Jitsu practitioners were in Brazil before also, even before Maeda, before Sada Miyako. But who introduced, when you say someone introduced something to a country, it's not the first person to practice it in the country. It has to do with the impact.
I think we should keep this for a next episode. That's a good one.
Yes.
Very controversial. Did Helio introduce Jiu-Jitsu to the United States? And was that Jiu-Jitsu Brazilian? Was that Jiu-Jitsu Gracie? Was that Jiu-Jitsu? I think it's very interesting when we have to say Japanese Jiu-Jitsu.
The word is Japanese, right?
But anyways.
It's a good topic.
It's a very good topic. So again, thank you so much. We appreciate all of you. Please don't forget to leave your comments. Also, if you can like our page, if you can subscribe to our page, that would be very helpful. And most importantly, plan to come visit us in Miami now that we can start all traveling again. Thank you so much.
And if you enjoyed, like, subscribe to our page.
One more time, yes.
Yes. And when you comment, make sure you comment based on, base your comment with facts. It's very important because we want to learn from you. So make sure that you always give us facts so that we can continue this great debate. And next time we can discuss some of your points.
But if you have opinions, it's okay too.
Yes, absolutely.
Good or bad.
Thank you very much for the support, for watching, listening to us, and we hope to see all of you very soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.